Моему дорогому другу и коллеге отца Филиппа Каллингтона, и с удовольствием передам ему слово. Dear friends, I am glad to introduce you my friend and colleague, Father Philip Calington, and I pass the floor to him without any further preamble. Father Philip, the screen is yours.
Thank you for the Gennady. I just want to check that everyone can hear me. Can you hear me well? Okay, yes, I saw some heads nodding. Okay, thank you very much. I'm very, very happy that we could gather here today for this very interesting topic. So I thought without further ado, I will start my my short talk, and then hopefully there'll be a nice discussion afterwards and questions. I'm really, really looking forward to that. So obviously today I'll be speaking about catechetical education and mission, its various challenges and perspectives. So missionary activity is, as we know, one of the most important aspects of the church, or should be so at least. Likewise, catechization is an essential part of church life. In a very clear way, these two aspects of church life go hand in hand. The mere mention of missionary work automatically should entail catechization, yet catechization in the context of missionary work is not and cannot be the same as in an Orthodox country, for instance, Russia. I will here today use Russia as the example of an Orthodox country usually. So while I believe the topic of mission in itself is rather straightforward, or at least more straightforward, the subtopic, if you wish, of catechization in the context of mission is one very much, I think, worth analyzing and discussing. So since the earliest days of Christianity, we can claim even, I believe we can claim even during the earthly life of our Lord, the church has engaged in catechization. I believe the first example of this is Christ himself, who would gather people and teach them about the faith, about God, and about spiritual life. I think the most famous example of this is the Sermon on the Mountain. What is also very clear from the example of Christ, of his apostles, and all throughout church history, is that catechization is not simply an intellectual or academic endeavor. Obviously, it has such elements. However, it is so much more than that, I believe. It is theoretical knowledge needed to practically live a Christian life, a life full of prayer, of love, of attending church, really everything that being a Christian means. Therefore, catechization is not simply theological studies as conducted at a university, for example. Instead, it is intellectual knowledge that has to first and foremost be transformed into a living life. Before I, however, set out to make an attempt to analyze this quite large topic, let me briefly acknowledge that I have not served in the context of classic missionary work for so long. Sure, I have lived a life always outside of non-Orthodox countries, and I've studied the history of mission and missionaries. However, me serving as an ordained clergyman in mission it's still rather new. So please be merciful and keep that in mind. So I would like to start off by telling you a bit about the situation today and explain some specifics. After this, I would like to look into the future and explore challenges and various perspectives. So the first thing I would like to bring up, and I believe this is the proper place to begin with, is in what ways does catechization in the context of missionary work differ from catechization in an already majority place country like Russia? Many of the potential converts who turn to the Orthodox Church in mission context have usually read something or do have a basic knowledge about Orthodoxy. If they did not, they would not even consider conversion. However, what is clear is that those potential catechumens and converts in the mission do require a different and often deeper approach to education. In Russia, most people, whether Orthodox or not, have some idea and sense of the Orthodox Church, their faith, its practices, way of life, its ethos. They've usually lived next to it. They might have family members who are Orthodox, or they even learned about it in school. If we, however, look at the various places in Southeast Asia, it is a very different situation. While people are aware, they are aware of Catholicism and Protestantism to various degrees, as these groups have been here much longer, Orthodoxy is still extremely foreign and new. Things that are often taken for granted in an Orthodox or even non-Orthodox Christian country are all of a sudden not so for granted in this new context. What also adds to this challenge in a place like Southeast Asia is the high diversity of religions. In Southeast Asia, just to mention a few, we have Islam, Buddhism, Hinduism, Taoism, Shintoism, Confucianism, countless forms of Christianity, some traditional, some more liberal and charismatic even. And we also have hundreds of folk religions. And not only that, very often all of these can be mixed together. So for instance, in Bali, where I am right now, we have the Hindu religion, which is often mixed with Buddhism, as well as local spirit religions. Likewise, for instance, in Singapore, many Chinese Protestants, ethnically Chinese Protestants, will also preserve some Buddhist traditions. So in that sense, Southeast Asia is truly like a melting pot, not only of cultures, but of religions as well. Therefore, anyone coming to the Orthodox Church in this context can have a very unique religious background. That's why catechization in mission must be extremely fundamental, I believe. Many aspects have to be taken into account that would perhaps traditionally not be taken into account in a place like Russia. I have myself dealt with some converts here, for instance, that come from Hinduism, and the very notion of what, or rather who God is, can be a challenge to explain. Hence, if we compare the context of mission to Russia, we see that while most of the knowledge that is passed on is of course the same, as the faith is one, the church is one, how we do it is and can be very different. In mission, I believe we have to start with the basic fundamentals and stay with them much longer. Not because of some intellectual limitations of Asians, no, but because it is important for them to understand the fundamentals of Christian Orthodox worldview very well. While this worldview was historically present in Russia and parts of Europe, this was obviously not the case in Southeast Asia, or at least not so to the same extent. One thing I myself have noticed, as well as my brother clergy who also serve here, is that people often learn the faith intellectually. They know the catechism, they know the dogmas very well, they might even know the church services. However, what they lack is the Orthodox culture. What I mean by that is they lack a deeper understanding that would allow them to not only know their faith or to practice it sometimes, but to actually live it, to live an Orthodox life. I think it's fair to say this is also sometimes a problem in Russia, obviously. The challenge with this here, however, in Southeast Asia, becomes that I do not believe we should in any way force on them any necessary Russian national culture or other national culture. Obviously, being in the Russian Orthodox Church, they will always be exposed to the 1,000-year deep history and culture of the Russian Orthodox country. But we will go deeper into the aspects of culture later, as I believe it is a very important aspect. So, however, the starting point of our analysis is that catechetical education in the missionary context, I argue, must be different in some aspects, and in some others, it actually must be the same as conducted in Russia. It must be adapted. It must be or created from scratch if so needed for every larger mission context. The catechetical education must be able to provide answers and examples that the history of universal orthodoxy. But still, it must nevertheless be conducted in a way so that people that actually receive it can comprehend it. So how should this be done? It is obviously very easy for us to sit and discuss all these matters and come up with ideas that seem very well. However, in the Orthodox Church, while always looking forward, always looking to the next soul that can be saved, I think we find comfort, inspiration, and guidance in history, or as we would simply call it, in tradition. It is not my job as a missionary in 2023 to reinvent the wheel. I should be able to adjust the wheel if so needed, but not to reinvent it. That's why I often look to the person of Saint Nicholas of Japan, the great saint who brought Orthodoxy to the other corner of Asia, to Japan. He actually left for us a lot of materials that we could follow and that we should follow. And I thought let's briefly look at two of them that I believe can be very, very helpful. So the first one is an absolute dedication to learning the local Japanese language, culture, and history that he did. He is said to have known Japanese history better than most Japanese people. He studied it for 8 years and did not convert a single person for the first 4 years of being in Japan. This is the first step for us as well. If we are to catechize in a way that the locals can understand and actually take to heart, we must know the locals, their way of life, their culture, religion, history, and languages. The second inspiration from St. Nicholas that I want to bring up is in a way a continuation of the one I just mentioned. I mentioned he studied for 8 years and he did not convert anyone for 4. I do not claim or think we have to wait as long as he did before we convert anyone. However, we must arm ourselves with patience for the long run, just like he did. We must sow and wait, sometimes longer than we would like to. And that seems all very easy, right? Obviously, it's far from easy, however. But it does provide a good starting point for our purpose here today. So if we look at the first example I mentioned, learning of the language, culture, history, and religion of the place the mission is conducted at, let's focus a little bit on that part. So these requirements will obviously vary depending on the country we are in. In Singapore, for instance, where I usually serve, English is one of the official languages. So this is less of a big issue there, considering English is spoken by many. And I think we could say it can be learned rather easily today. However, in, say, a place like Indonesia, English is not widely spoken at all. In fact, the country ranks in the bottom of countries when it comes to English proficiency. Hence, for mission educational systems to even begin, the language barriers must be taken down. This would usually entail and mean that the missionary has to learn the local language. However, this is obviously easier said than done. Hence, today, translators are very often used in catechetical education in Indonesia. For instance, right now, I am in Bali, where the parish is actually mostly Russian-speaking, as Bali is, as I'm sure you know, Bali is full of Russian speakers right now. However, there is also a part of the parish that is local Balinese Indonesian people, some who have already converted and some interested in conversion and some catechumens as well. And every Sunday I conduct Orthodox education with them. And most of the time, one of the locals who is fluent in English translates into Indonesian. This is actually less than ideal for a number of reasons. Firstly, I'm not able to engage in any deeper or more personal conversations with these locals. I think it creates an unnecessary distance between me and them. Another, perhaps even more pressing issue is that whenever we are using live translation, a part of the message gets lost. And not because of the incompetency of whoever is translating, but simply because it is difficult, very difficult to translate the topics of Orthodox theology into a language, Indonesian in this case, that is actually very foreign to many of the terms that are being used. Likewise, when we conduct our question and answer session at the end of each lesson, it is difficult for me to always understand the correct tone, context, and even deeper meaning of a particular question. The conclusion this leads me to is that for a genuine catechetical education to take place in missionary context, it has to be done in the local language and/or in a language that most people can at least understand. This should be preferably done without any live translation, as this creates other problems and challenges. In this sense, it is vital to follow St. Nicholas and truly learn the language of the country we are to spread the faith in. Not only language, of course, but also culture, history, and local religious traditions. The reason I believe we have to learn these traditions, not only the language, is that they also contribute to a fuller understanding of the language. Language develops, as we know, alongside culture and religion usually, and is not isolated. So in Indonesian, for example, we have 4 levels. The language has 4 levels in Indonesian. The first level, to simplify it, the first level is slang and everyday language used among peers, among friends. Second level is the more respectful level, language used to one's parents or elders. Third level is the academic and intellectual one. While the fourth level and the final level, so to speak, is how we speak to and about God. So if we were to say learn Indonesian on the app Duolingo, which is quite popular, we would most likely learn the first 2 levels. And if asked to speak to God or about God, we would use a language that the locals would find not very fitting or acceptable in connection to God. This is where the knowledge of culture, history, and religion of the place comes into play. Because if we know the deeper cultural heritage of a place, we are quickly able to understand these things and proceed accordingly. An interesting example of this, is the word Allah, which is obviously Arabic for God and widely used by Muslims worldwide. And also, of course, by Christians who speak Arabic, they also use this word. However, in Indonesia, due to Islamization, this word is also used for God universally in Indonesia, even if Arabic is not used as a spoken language in Indonesia. Now, with a proper understanding of the cultural and historical context of Indonesia, we can make an attempt to either work around the usage of that word or use it with a deep explanation that will make people understand we are here not referring to the same God that the Muslims claim to worship, but rather to the triune Christian God. This has become clear to me when my translator sometimes translates God into Jesus Christ and doesn't make the distinction. However, when I say God, it might be important that they understand I mean God in that moment and not specifically the second person of the Holy Trinity. That's why we need the deep knowledge of the language, but also culture, history, and religions that shape the language and its usage. Hence, what is clear is that language is a vital aspect of missionary work, and especially the educational part of mission. Without it, little serious work could be done, I believe. Of course, this seems like a given, but in practice, you would be surprised. We actually do have a long way to go. And just as St. Nicholas of Japan, we need to prepare for the long run, because such things take time and will take time. Likewise, deeper understanding of the culture, religion, and of the place are obviously very, very, very important. Excuse me. So it is easy to come to a place like Bali, sit down with local Hindus, and tell them that they worship demons, right? This is obviously true in many ways from the Orthodox perspective, but it is not the way, I do not believe this is the way to gather potential converts. St. Nicholas of Japan made this very clear when he forbade his missionaries to ever criticize the local Shinto Buddhist religion of Japan. Instead, by understanding the religion deeper, its history and cultural context, we should preach orthodoxy in such a manner that clearly demonstrates its truths and beauty, but at the same time clearly demonstrates without attacks why the local religion is wrong or lacking. So, as you have noticed, I am sure, I have just been speaking about myself or other missionaries who come to a new country for missionary work, and this is obviously not correct. While the initial work of a mission, of the missions conducted by clergy that come to a new place, with time, locals have to be able to help and in some cases take over this mission activity. This was done in Japan by St. Nicholas, who had a practice of establishing parishes, educating locals, preferably ordaining these locals to clergy, and then moving on to a new place, establishing new parishes there, and following the same pattern. He called it delegating. This is done in Southeast Asia as well. Only a few weeks ago, a new priest was ordained in Thailand for the Vadim from Myanmar, who will serve in the Diocese of Thailand, which includes his native Myanmar. Likewise, in Indonesia, which is the largest part of the Diocese of Singapore, this has been going on for a longer period of time. In July, we had a meeting of all the clergy of the diocese in Jakarta, and I'm very happy to report that an absolute majority of the clergy serving in Indonesia permanently are local Indonesians who have been ordained. This obviously solves the problem of language very well. However, it presents another challenge: education for those who are to be ordained. Usually, when possible, these men who aim to serve as clergy for the church would get sent to various theological academies in Russia, where they would learn not simply theology, knowledge of faith, but also the Orthodox ethos, the Orthodox way of life. I personally believe this has to be the main goal of actually studying in Russia. Academic knowledge can be transmitted in Indonesia or perhaps even online. However, the way to live, pray daily, attend services, serve the services, it's invaluable for these men who are to be ordained that they truly, truly learn this. It is, however, therefore important, in my opinion, to connect the catechetical education we here focus on with the seminary education that the potential candidates for ordination will attend. While seminary is obviously a much deeper dive into our faith, I do believe that it can only become an option to these potential young men if they have gone through proper catechization at home in their own country. So sorry for jumping to the side topic of clergy education, but as I said, I do believe in the grand scheme of things, it is highly connected to catechetical education in mission. And all of this leads me now to the second point from St. Nicholas that I want to bring up, which is patience, the long game, so to speak. To achieve all what I have just mentioned in terms of learning the language, culture, history, and religion, as well as training locals as clergy and catechetical teachers, we need time. Time is needed. And not only time, but also continuity. I do believe this is present, thank God, right now in Southeast Asia at the moment. Since the creation of the Exarchate of Southeast Asia at the end of 2018, and a few years before it became an Exarchate, it has been led by one and the same hierarch, the Patriarchal Exarch Metropolitan Sergei. I cannot stress enough how important this is and has been. I believe that the faithful in a missionary context are indeed like small children, spiritually speaking, that need the stability of an ever-present parent. That's why continuity and time is so vital in missionary educational context. We see it in the life of most missionary saints of the church. They did usually go to one place and stay for a longer time. They had a long-term plan, long-term vision, and this is vital to have today. It's absolutely vital for us to have this long-term plan, patience, and vision for the future. Okay, so having just explained some aspects of the situation today for you, I would like to move on to a more general overview of challenges and perspectives moving forward for the future. So the first thing I would like to address is the experiences of the last century and how we cannot, I repeat, we cannot fall back into them regardless of where we are conducting mission, educating and serving. Often in the history of the church, especially in the last century and among all local Orthodox churches, mission has often been an afterthought. If we look at America, North America, for instance, most clergy were sent there and they were sent to serve their own local ethnic people who had emigrated to North America. This meant that church services and any form of education was conducted only in the native language of the people who came to North America. The thought about opening up to locals was a very rare thought. Obviously, St. Herman of Alaska did do this in the 1800s, but in mainland America, USA, and Canada, this was very rarely done. For this reason, there is up until today a sort of stigma towards Orthodoxy, that Orthodoxy is nationalistic and that it's closed off. Sadly, I do think we must admit that such claims do at times, sometimes have some substance to them. And that in fact, this was how things often were. Slowly, things started to change. And today, most local churches do consider the missionary aspects, obviously, whenever they are sending clergy to a new place. The reason I bring this up is that we have to keep bringing it up. It's very easy to fall right back into it, and we have to avoid this at every cost. I do believe that most often, these things are not done on purpose or with intent. Instead, it is a natural human tendency. We come to a new place, we surround ourselves with people who speak our language and share our religion and culture. And we remain content. We remain happy in this, we can say ghetto, right? Not in the negative sense, but a group that is locked in. While this, of course, is very important because we are, after all, not globalists. We still believe in preservation of, for instance, the rich culture and language of Russia. But we also have to be able to fit in an openness and missionary thinking into this whole picture. What I mean is, we are not to choose one over the other, but rather try to do both. Give Russian speakers, Russians who have emigrated, what they need to preserve their heritage, religious, cultural, language, while also being completely open and welcoming to locals. And this is obviously a challenge. And sometimes this takes time and very much effort. Again, time is of the essence. It can often involve a level of resistance in many parishes. It is therefore important that it is implemented gradually among the parishes. It can start as, for instance, implementation of local languages into services, for instance, of the Our Father prayer being said in a few languages or the Creed. However it is done, it has to be done with pastoral awareness and in a delicate manner. I do believe the solution to this would be an explicit intention to conduct missionary activity along side serving the Russian-speaking expats living in a place. And either way, what I just mentioned is actually more of an issue in big cities like Singapore, where I serve, or Kuala Lumpur, where there's quite a lot of many Russian speakers. Once we get to smaller towns and even villages of, say, Indonesia and the Philippines, this is usually actually no longer an issue. Now, let me talk briefly about something that I call contextual catechization. Contextual catechization is something I believe to be very important. Let me briefly then explain what I mean by that. Of course, at the core, catechization and education, religious education, should be based on the universal truths of our Orthodox faith, regardless if they are taught in Moscow, New York, Dubai, Tokyo, whatever. However, as I have explored before, every place, every geographical place has its own challenges and particular problems. What we need to be able to establish going forward today and for the future is an approach to catechetical education and mission that not only acknowledges the local context, but also uses it to its benefit. What I'm here getting at, I suppose, is the acculturation of the
Well, I'm afraid there are some issues with your sound. Or isn't only my?
I also hear nothing.
No, there are no sounds. Yeah.
Can I check the microphone?
Can you hear me now?
Yeah, good. Thank you.
Yeah, so I have no idea what happened. Sorry. Okay, so let me go back a few lines. Okay, so I was speaking about acculturation, and some claim that the first example of this in church history, we could claim, is the Greek terms that were used to define theology of the church, most of which, as we know, came from Greek philosophy, pre-Christian Greek philosophy. Likewise, smaller and less important aspects can be given as an example. For instance, in Japan, where Orthodox Japanese Christians take off their shoes when they enter a church, which is a cultural and religious sign in Japan of respect for the holiness of a place. So this acculturation can be manifested in many various ways. Yet the question is always how far the church should go in this process. I believe this question is at the very center of mission and catechization of the mission. And believe me, it is a very disputed question without a clear universal answer. So I hope we can perhaps have some questions and opinions about this later in our Q&A, as it is a very, very interesting topic. And so the last thing I want to bring up before we jump to that Q&A is social media catechization. And it's one very vital thing. It's a very vital thing for the catechetical work, especially here in Asia, it's social media. So a few years ago, let's say a decade ago, this was seen as a side thing, something sometimes connected as a side thing to the daily activities of a priest. Today, however, especially in Asia, as I mentioned, this is very vital. When young people in Asia want to find out about something, they often go to social media, to Instagram, to Facebook, to TikTok, to whatever. We can observe a similar phenomenon in Russia, in Europe, in America, all around the world. And in Russia in particular, there are few priests who combined have millions of followers online, for instance. So catechization has to therefore extend to these various online platforms. Many priests have, for instance, weekly question and answer sessions where followers can ask questions and the priest answers. Likewise, recording of sermons or talks about various topics is also something that should be done. In a sense, such catechization becomes a worldwide catechization as it can reach everyone everywhere. However, it should still be done for a region specifically. Why? Because every part of the world has their own issues, their own challenges, their own problems. And while following a priest in Russia is surely edifying for someone in Singapore, that priest will very rarely address specific questions that a Singaporean can relate to. Another aspect of social media that must be addressed, and there are many various radical forms, excuse me, another aspect of social media that we must address are the various radical forms of so-called internet orthodoxy online. These radical forms can be radically conservative or even radically liberal in nature. However, one thing that they have in common is the aggressiveness with which they attack the so-called mainline canonical church. Some of these groups, extreme groups, are even themselves canonical. They are usually very successful at what they are doing. And in America, especially where I lived for a while, they have managed to get many people, usually young converts, to their sides, which has created many, many spiritual problems. Such people and groups truly use social media as a catechetical tool, no doubt about it. In Indonesia, this has resulted in non-canonical schismatic groups at times growing, even recently claiming to have their own Indonesian Orthodox bishop. It is therefore of even higher importance that the catechization on social media is conducted by the church, as it is for many people the first place where they will actually encounter orthodoxy. So I truly see the social media activity of the church as catechization. It's truly important, especially in the context of Asia. In a way, I do believe that the Russian church is on the absolute forefront of this online catechization, but of course, more and more can be achieved, and especially so in languages that are other than Russian. So just my quick conclusions. As you see, there are many challenges, difficulties, perspectives, but also, of course, positives. I have here just scratched the surface. Hopefully, it has helped you to get a good starting point in the study of these complex issues. I have, of course, left out many issues, which I thought were perhaps not a good point to start with. The catechetical education in mission is vital. I want to claim it is essential, and without it, there cannot be a true missionary work. While there are many problems and challenges, I am very hopeful that things are moving in the correct direction. The church is a giant living organism, and things, they do take time, sometimes even decades. What is important is that we all agree on the importance of proper catechization in the context of mission, and together work from there. This takes time, money, and dedication, but I truly believe that this is an endeavor that is blessed and liked by God. Thank you so much for listening.
Thank you, Father. I typed several comments and a question in the chat, and there are others, and all are invited to ask their questions and make their comments just via their microphones. So first, let's comment and answer text in the chat, and then you can speak freely. You can switch on your cameras. So now it's time for free discussion. All are welcomed.
Okay, so maybe I can start off by reading the questions I can see, and then doing my best to answer them. So the first question is that one of the problems may be that a particular country may not have a common language that is equally well understood by all inhabitants. And there are many countries in the Exarchate. So the problem of training more missionaries is very important. Yes, surely. For instance, if we look at the whole Exarchate, there's many languages. And if we just focus even on my own diocese, which is the Diocese of Singapore, which encompasses Singapore, Malaysia, Indonesia, East Timor, and Papua New Guinea, again, we have countless languages. I mean, in Singapore alone, we have 4 official languages. In Indonesia, I think you have 1 main language, but you have tens, if not hundreds, of local languages. And this has proven to be a very big challenge indeed. Because I even know of cases where you would have a group of catechumens and half of them would not even understand the so-called mainline language of Indonesia. So this obviously this almost like adds another spin of challenges, another problem, when all of a sudden, if you come as a missionary and you want to learn the language, but there's like hundreds of islands and they might have very different languages. So this is a very big problem indeed. And in these places, for now, I mean, there's no other way but to use translators. Although I know that our bishops are doing everything they can to ordain local people from such tribes who know these languages, but of course this takes time, and it always comes back to the question of time. to invest time, right? So that it can grow as it should. Any comments on that question, Father? Because it was your question, Father Gennady.
Yeah, thank you. It wasn't. I was just interested about the situation. Thank you.
Yeah,
There
yeah.
are
No,
two
no.
more
That's
from. There are two more from me,
it.
and one from Paul, at least.
So the next question is: enculturation should not only be compared to European traditions, for example, the Japanese take off the shoes when entering a temple. As remember, Moses was ordered to take off his shoes at the tabernacle. This will be seen. Yes, exactly. Actually, many of the local traditions we might encounter, we can actually read about either in the early church or, as you mentioned, Moses already, in the pre-Christian time. So we should be open to some of these practices and some of these traditions. Obviously, the question is always how much, and this is always, I think, the most debated question. We'll have various answers on a scale from 1 to 10. We'll have one person on each scale trying to argue why and why not we should adjust to these things. But I am more positive than negative. But it has to be also be done in a correct way, because, for instance, one of the schismatic groups here in Indonesia, the Orthodox schismatic groups, they introduced the same practice of taking off their shoes for people before they go into church. However, in Indonesia, this was only done by Muslims. And many of these people in this group are ex-Muslims. And then that's another question: should it then be done, even though Islam only came to Indonesia 500 years ago? So it creates so many various layers. I have no problem that people take off their shoes, but it always ends up with a question: why? And should we do it? But it's good you pointed out, because we are often blinded by our own European context, when instead we can actually see that many of these practices are actually Christian or not foreign to Christianity, for sure. As you know, our institute came into contact with the situation with the blessing of the Patriarch to help the executive education. But we quickly realized what you are talking about. Education in English is not very relevant to the mission. Will we be able to help in any way?
Your microphone. Okay.
Yeah, I was muted, but sorry.
No,
So I think you heard the question. Yes. Yes, it was even a big surprise for me when I came here and joined the mission, just how irrelevant English actually is. Because if you have young men who want to be priests or deacons, and they don't know Russian and they don't know English, and they have to learn somewhere, and I think the natural choice have been to teach them Russian so that they can study in Russian seminaries. But even that is not as easy, because Russian is obviously, I would say, much more difficult language than English. So as you rightly point out in your question, it is a big problem, and I do think that our institute might be able to help, but it has to be done. Yeah, it's difficult to answer blank, because it is a very complex issue. What we are doing right now, we are trying to gather materials that we will decide should be translated into local languages. This is the first step. Even this has not been done fully. So, what materials should be used for educational purposes? And then moving from there, I think our institute could come in once there is more of a structure, of a backbone, so to speak. But right now, it's still very much, island to island, country to country. How can we make it work here? But it's certainly a very difficult problem to solve, the language barrier, which we hope should be solved once more people are ordained from here. But still, they have to also learn languages. For Philip, thank you very much for your interesting report. As someone who also spent time in Asia, I'd like to ask your opinion on the following. Do you think that initial certain religious indifference that traditionally exists in Southeast Asia is now increased by the modern world's general rejection of religion as a commonly accepted virtue, which must make missionary work there quite difficult? How does one even start to spread God's word in that environment? So one observation I've had since coming here, and others share it, is that in Southeast Asia, religion matters to people. unlike in the Western world. Obviously, we are speaking about other religions than Orthodoxy, but people usually cannot imagine a life without some religious aspects to them. We might claim they are cultural, you know, like going to the temple and offering something on New Year's, or other feasts. But people in Southeast Asia, in my experience, are actually much more aware of spiritual matters, much more than in the West. Obviously, the problem is that this is not Christianity usually. So it's still a very difficult thing. Like I mentioned, the Hindu convert I dealt with, you know, explaining to someone who obviously has been a practicing Hindu what our concept of God is even that is very challenging. And then when you mention the Trinity to a Hindu, they might get some idea that it's maybe similar to their understanding of God or gods. How does one even spread God's word in that environment? It's very difficult. We have to take what we can take from their past religions and try to find as many commonalities without obviously jeopardizing our faith, because this is always the risk. You know, how much can we water down our faith so that they can understand? But it has to be done to some extent, not the watering down, but the comparison, you know, to say, look, we also believe this, you believe this, and move from there somehow. I believe that is the way moving forward, but it is very difficult. Could you please elaborate somewhat on the Orthodox way of life you mentioned, and on the specific of this way in Asia? What are the differences compared to Europe or Russia? So I think when I mentioned it, I was more speaking about that we can teach people about Orthodoxy. We can teach them, you know, what we believe. We can teach them the creed. We can give them books to read. We can have, you know, they can go to church. But still, they will not most of the time be able to have this fullness of Orthodox culture around them. You know, when you go to a place like Moscow, even though it was communist for 70 years, everything is somehow soaked in Orthodoxy. You know, Russian history is soaked with Orthodox. Around every corner, there's a church. You know, there's priests walking down the streets. They see old ladies take blessings from priests. It's small things that, in a mission context, these people are not able to see and get. And this is, I think, the most difficult part, is to actually teach them that Orthodoxy is not something you do on Sunday mornings. It's something you should always do. It's a way of life. And I think that in that sense, it becomes very, very difficult how to achieve that, because obviously most people cannot go to Russia and visit Russia, you know. But they need this cultural orthodoxy as well, even if that is sometimes looked down upon, right? That we are only cultural Christians. But they would need that so that they can see, you know, Christos Vaskrese on the street. You know, they don't have that in Indonesia. And in Russia, you know, even atheists will say that because their neighbors celebrate, right? So that is yeah. So this Orthodox way of life, this Orthodox ethos, has to be established in the place, and I think slowly grow, which takes time. Again, we always somehow in these topics, whenever I was preparing, I always end up going backwards, and the answer is time. You know, we need time. We need time. You know, we need time. We need generations to convert, like happened in Japan. You know, where kids are actually born into Orthodox families. We don't have that yet here. Most people are you know, they converted during their lifetime. So this is a challenge. And I think that was all the written questions. Yes. So if anyone has comments or questions here, I would be more than happy to engage. I can't hear you, Father. I can't hear you. You got unmute, Father.
Does anyone have any questions? No. So thank you, Father. We thank you for the interesting and informative seminar, and our prayers are always with you and with your parishes, and we would be grateful if you would keep us informed of the situation. So we're staying in touch and are looking for a new next seminars. And thank to all participants, and that's all. Goodbye. You're
Goodbye.
always
Thank you so much.
invited to our seminars. Goodbye. Thank you very much. The record will be on our YouTube channel in a few days. and on the YouTube channel of Father Philip as well.